Well, welcome to the last Associates Workshop of the year. And it's been, yeah, this is sort of our fourth, I suppose, Associates meeting. We had our last one was in Manchester at the Symposium, and then we had a couple more earlier this year. So this one is to focus on child's play, so including children and young people in your decision making. We have two excellent panelists and a chair, Melissa Lacide, who's our senior engagement officer at the foundation. And we'll be talking about sort of tips and tricks to overcome some of the obstacles that people might find when trying to include children and young people in their planning. I will hand over to Melissa now. Thank you.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this Associates webinar. As Anik mentioned, the theme is child's play, including children and young people in your decision making. So I'm absolutely delighted to introduce you to our fabulous panelists. We are joined by Victoria Thornton OBE, who is an expert in architecture and education and social value development, having established Open City House 28 years ago, pioneering creative architectural learning methodologies for adults and young people. She has held positions on numerous boards and has established a host of initiatives such as My City 2 and Architecture in Schools. Currently, she is chair of the Thornton Education Trust, president of the Architectural Association and Design Museum's Built Environment and Learning Committee. And Victoria is also the co-author of London's Guide to Contemporary Architecture and was awarded an honorary fellowship of the RIBA, an honorary MA from London Metropolitan University, and an OBE for services to architecture and education. We are also joined by Azzees Minott, who is the co-founder and COO of 2 to 3 Degrees, an award-winning social enterprise empowering young people through confidence building and employability programmes. Since 2016, they've worked with over 10,000 young people and have helped deliver built environment programmes to young people across the UK. Azzees has been recognised by BizNow as one of their 29 women changing the face of UK real estate in 2023, and she has an extensive understanding and knowledge of the challenges in the built environment on engaging with young people. A very warm welcome to you both. So I think without further ado, we'll kick off with doing a bit of a Q&A with the panellists. So starting with Azzees and then bringing in Victoria, the first question for you is, what is the most enriching aspect for you in including children and young people in the built environment?
Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to say thank you, Quality of Life, for inviting me to join you on the very last conversation. So yeah, really excited to be here. There's so much that I and the team that we work with enjoy in terms of engaging with young people. But one of the things that I think is super pivotal is when we're trying to engage young people on our built environment programs, we're also trying to help ensure that we set them up with skills that they will be able to use for their life. Now, we're working with a group of young people local to a particular development, and not only are they going to be more informed about the development itself, the development process itself, meeting different professionals, but in that design of a program, you're also equipping them with key skills as well, such as how do you engage with professionals? How do you articulate yourself and your idea and design in a way that makes sense and is inclusive to different community members as well? And so being able to see a young person come to our very first workshop, and this happened on a program that I'm very familiar with. We had the very first workshop, we had 40 young people from the local area, and I asked them, what is one thing that you want to develop for yourself on this program? And the young boy said to me, I really want to improve my confidence. He stood up. I encourage everyone to stand up when they speak. He said it very meekly, but the journey of that young person has resulted in him actually being the keynote speaker for a community event that we delivered. He also sat on the community foundation where he distributes money to his local community. He's also now an ambassador for his local community youth group. And he's really engaged in volunteering. And this is 3 years post the program. So seeing his skill develop is literally the most incredible, him and other young people, obviously, but seeing their skills develop so they can use it in any aspect of life is the most enriching part of what we get to do.
Thank you, Azzees. If I can bring Victoria in to bring your perspective.
Yes, and again, thanks very much for inviting me. It's great to be talking about this subject because I think challenges are really sometimes an important part of this, because we can all do what should we be doing, but really what the challenges are sometimes are the barriers. So we're trying to break down those barriers. So hopefully we'll be able to do a bit of that today. Totally concur with these, all those things. So I think the two other areas, one is when you're talking about built environment, because it's usually we're always doing about problem solving, it's sort of that aspect, but it actually shows a creative element as well. Actually, everyone can be creative. And I think that brings through, and partly in schools now, we don't have that much in the curriculum. So working these kind of projects allows them to realize they too can be creative. And I think that's coming through is fantastic when you see that actually happens. And the other thing is when I think, especially with young people, but both children and young people, I mean, we talk about 5 to 18-year-olds basically, is that they really are the voice of everybody because they see their siblings, they see the parents, they see the grandparents. And what I always find extraordinary, people assume they're very kind of sort of selfish in their own bubble, but actually they see the world more than the rest of us. They see the whole world and their whole community. And so when one's talking, I remember one example where they were dressing up, and I'm sure we've done this all the time, dressing up as the grandparent, the child, the single parent with a kind of pram, and acting out the issues when one's looking at development. So they think about all those things. And we've got a video, and it just makes me laugh every time I see this thing, because they epitomize actually the problems and how they thought we could solve them, particularly in this development project it was a few years ago.
Oh, that's really lovely to hear. I can see lots of people smiling because it just feels like you've really hit on a couple of really lovely points, which we'll bring in later into the session when we do some of our reflections and our takeaways. It might be worth going on to what you mentioned, Victoria, earlier around some of the challenges, and then bringing in Azzees, if that's okay. So what are the two challenges that you find that you need to overcome when doing engagement with children and young people?
I think it's recognizing the different groups you might have to reflect on the type of group that you're working with, rather than one fits all. And I think sometimes we tend to do that because we have programs. So that sort of barrier can be a barrier because we're not really reflecting their needs, their particular needs. So I think that is one of the I would say a barrier sometimes. So there's other barriers, which is really about which I think maybe the next question is really the relevance of young people's input. But if one just talking about them, it's actually recognizing how they will engage and what they will do. One example for me was when with Open City, we did part of the neighbourhood plans when the government decided neighbourhood plans were going to be the thing. So lots of local neighbourhood plans were set up, and everybody said, we want to work with, we want to include children and young people in it. So their idea was, we have a committee, so they would join the committee, and you had to say, no, that is not the way you're going to get these children and young people involved in it. You have to think from their perspective. And obviously where the audience is, well, obviously is schools when you're looking at one area. And youth centres would have been, but again, it's another barrier now because we have so few youth centres where at one time you could actually engage through that. So there's become more barriers than there were before. But it's really about thinking where they are, but how are you going to look at the ways in which you're engaging them, but think of also the particular groups and the needs of them. So I would say that's some of the barriers there.
Thank you, Victoria. Azzees, can bring you in?
Yeah, so there's a couple. I think straight out of the gate, I think the first one is the client sometimes. So the client not understanding or valuing the youth engagement experience that we will take these young people on. I think I need to go back a little bit for everyone to understand how we work. So we work with 14 to 25-year-olds. Relative to a local site. We will also speak to the team about the types of young people that we want to engage with, how far they should be from the site, how they relate to the site, do they live, work, or study? And then we will also ensure that we're designing a program that best suits the needs of that particular group and demographic local to the area. Now, the group of young people are, as I mentioned, are 14 to 25 typically, and these young people will come on our program outside of school hours. So this is quite unique in a way, because actually, how are you going to captivate an audience group of teenagers outside of school for them to actually want to come? And so the first point, as I mentioned, sometimes clients are a barrier to understanding the value of this work and how we need to articulate to the young person the value that they are also going to get from it. So put quite simply, sometimes clients want an output from a young person, but they don't think about how can their young person get something from this particular program, which is why I started the point of the value that we bring is, and the thing that's most enriching is skills, because actually if we market the program to help the young person identify what they can get from the program, we have a two-way exchange. So sometimes at the outset, that's not really understood, but we have to do some work to help in clients understand that. And then the second one is budget. So remember, I said that we've got teenagers. We have 89%, particularly when we're working with London, we have 89% of young people from the global majority. So that is a term used in replace or in preference of the term BAME, which is Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups, but we use the term global majority. So we typically are working with 89% of people from that community. And if we also think about trying to engage young people who wouldn't typically be involved in a project like this. So for example, we're trying to reach young people who may not be in the youth council or may not be on a ambassador program for their local community. So we're trying to reach a group of young people that are outside of those bubbles, right? And as Victoria mentioned, youth clubs, some youth clubs have closed, and sometimes it's really hard to get young people to be referred from schools because they've got so many different options available, and teachers are quite inundated. So budget becomes a problem because budget is actually an enabler to introducing this particular program and concept to young people. So we pay young people for their time. They are youth consultants. They're having a tangible and material difference to the work that we're doing. We pay for their food, we pay for their travel. These are really important points to include, because actually you say that youth engagement, you might think that youth engagement is quite cheap, but to add all of these additional elements, they're not anymore. And the reason why it needs to be put at the forefront is because these are sometimes a barrier for the young people themselves to even access a program such as this. So if we can try to remove the barriers from young people, then that can help them attend a program like the ones that we deliver. And it's worth saying that we have 90% retention on our programs for longer than 12 months, which is, this is completely outside of school. So it's worth saying all of those factors also contribute to a successful program. But if we don't have clients who understand the true budget of this, then that can become a barrier to actually doing the engagement work in the first place.
Thanks, Azzees. I think from what Victoria and Azzees have been saying, it's not unheard of. I think we've heard of these things before, and it continues to surprise us to think that this is still happening. So I guess just to unpick a little bit as to what Azzees and Victoria were saying, how from the experience of your projects might you, I guess, give some support to clients around trying to think about things from the perspective of young people and prioritizing that, and because what you're talking about shows how it's supporting young people to articulate the value of being involved and shaping their places, but there might be something that the clients can be doing to kind of build in extra steps to ensure that is happening, to basically think about the needs of your children and young people as part of that process.
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is that no program is the same, and that's similar to what Victoria was saying. there shouldn't be a cookie cutter program template, because all the young people, all of the communities that we're engaging with are unique, and they need to be managed in that way. So it's really important for us at the beginning of a program to sit down, to plan out, and to build good relationships with local community members. And I think that is a real turning point and way to help the client, particularly if they're a developer, to understand that, doing this work well and making sure we plan it in properly is going to help with your ongoing community engagement. So our work is a great supplement to comms agencies and PR teams, because they're already doing engagement with a particular demographic, but we're trying to help supplement that work with adding the voices of young people. So trying to make sure that we're building that into their whole timeline, I think can be a real eye opener when we sit down, talk to them, we're in the initiation stage, and we help them realize how impactful this program is going to be, yes, for young people, but too for the legacy of reputation of that developer in the local area as well, which, when we think about it, that's also what they want. They want their plans to go through. They want them not to be delayed. They want to save money, and they also want to make sure that in the process, their reputations are not damaged.
Yeah, and I would say absolutely. And I think there's sort of, in a way, when we talk about engaging children and young people, there's sort of different kind of areas. And if I take our awards, which are just closing the end of this week, which is Inspire Future Generations, we recognise that some of those programmes that are coming forward for submissions, some are those, we call them self-created. So there'd be programmes that people want to do just for sake or they feel part of their social value. There's others that go through development, so planning, procurement route. And then we have the local authorities who are looking more at the sort of master plan development because it's their community. And I think there's different ways that foundation. And we sort of there is a slight difference between those. I think, as Azzees mentioned, development. I think if the simple thing, if it's not in the budget, it's not going anywhere. So if it's not in the budget, everybody's working really hard to make it happen, but it shows that they don't believe in it. They don't see it as part of Azzees, be it their marketing, their social value. They don't see this as part of their development process. And I know from many of the organizations who are doing this work, and a lot of you may be in this room, that they often feel that they are under the pro bono bit. And so how you expect these organizations or individuals to be able to do the best they can when there's no funding, and on top of that, going back to these are paying. If it's a procurement, it's giving value to that planning application, and therefore they should be paid for it because they are giving their advice, their expertise in effect. And often you get something quite different. I remember with one, when we did one with the developers and architects, we did a whole program, and it was under our My City 2 program. And the architects at the end said, if I knew what I know now, we would have engaged them earlier. And actually there is a lot of benefit, but we seem to do it at the last point rather than the beginning. And secondly, without naming one of the, because I know it's coming from submissions, one of the developments have put it right in, it's a 25-year program, but they've put it right at the front as part of their programming. However, I will have to say that I know he really had to work hard to get that funding in place to do it. So I think if you don't have that funding there, you're not really being serious about the program. And I think it's important we recognize that and say, and in a way, as Azzees was pointing out, we need to, perhaps all of us, I think, articulate the value of actually engaging young children, young people in this process, because taking on this concern or lack of believing that they have value, I think the other is really needs to be put forward to the front to recognize this. But there is another issue with this, talk about challenges today. There isn't enough evidence out there. And I think without that evidence, we do have an issue as well. But there is evidence out there, but it hasn't really been articulated well enough. And lastly, with that, children and young people have much more of a positive view about development than adults. We all put barriers in place. We say, but you can't do that, or it's not my backyard. Actually, children and young people have a much more open idea of what a development or what could be in it than we ever do. And again, going back to that creative element, they come up with ideas that we most probably would say no to straight away because we've got too many of the buts in there.
Thank you, Azzees and Victoria. I think we'll loop back to some of those challenges in the reflections, but it does lead quite nicely on to the poll that Anik sent out before the session, but also just as the session was starting. And this was to kind of better understand answers from the associates around what are the main issues when trying to include children and young people's voices in your projects. Anik, I don't know if you're able to share that result.
Is that coming up now?
Yeah, we can see that. Yeah.
So I asked all of the associates in the sort of original email, what are the main barriers when trying to include children and young people's voices in your projects? So we had 64% come back and say children and young people are not seen as key stakeholders, which is sort of the largest chunk there. So we'll sort of focus a bit on that, and then the other sort of parts about lack of familiarity or project cost, and maybe concerns of lack of buy-in. But yeah, we're looking for sort of some tips and tricks from both Azzees and Victoria about how sort of we can combat that and overcome those barriers. Thanks. I'll start off. So yeah, so either who would you like to start with? We start with Azzees. Maybe do you have sort of anything that leaps out at you for sort of children and young people that are not seen as key stakeholders? Is there anything that you would offer in that sense?
I would just piggyback on what Victoria said. A really key, sorry, can you guys hear me now? Okay, perfect. I'd piggyback off what Victoria said around young people's diverse perspectives on development, particularly when it comes to height and massing. They have a different view on this, and we have to bear in mind that this is because them as local community members don't feel that they will have access to housing in the same way previous generations have. And so that viewpoint alone now encourages them to think differently about how we solve that as a problem, or as we've described in the past as a housing crisis, but how we actually think about solutions. And so I think it's really important that if we frame the conversation around young people are key stakeholders because they're going to be the ones who may live in these places that you're creating, but also they are key stakeholders in articulating their views on this. And so what I mean by that is, on some of the programs we've worked on, we've actually had young people go to planning committee and consultations and actually speak for or against the project. And that's really important because in the case of Westminster, for example, one of the projects we worked on, that was the first and only time in which young people have come to planning committee to speak on development. And so that has a lot of power and weight when it's in the eyes of the council members and also the planning committee as well when they're considering it. So I think as organizations who are passionate about engaging young people, we actually have to think about where can we also continue to help them influence and shape society. So is it by them speaking at council? Is it them speaking on a podcast or in a news article? How can we help platform their voices in a way that will help influence the sector to understand, no, these are very important key stakeholders, not just for this development, but more generally also for the local community as well. And we've seen that working really, really well.
Thank you, Azzees. Victoria, would you like to come in?
I'm going to say slightly different tack in the sense of looking at local authorities. Just using an example, it was barking and Dagenham at one point. I mean, it's a few years ago now. And this is what another interesting thing is. We've been talking about this, maybe because I've been doing it quite a while. A lot of the issues still keep coming up and we haven't really resolved them. But I always think right time, right place, maybe this is one of these. And just as slightly going off piece, obviously with housing coming up, to actually ensure that we have placemaking in housing development. And I think when we're talking about children and young people, that is where they're going to live. So we should be actually using this opportunity to actually ensure that their voice is in with all this housing, massive housing development. And I was talking with Homes England and with someone on the design, and they say it's still very much on the side and it needs to be brought forward. But talk about local authorities of how you can do it. Barking and Dagenham set up a youth panel. And we actually trained the youth to look at planning applications. Now, it was more about development plans than actual planning applications, but it gave them a view back to the council of their thoughts on what should be happening within their borough. And we trained the chair of it as well, who was an adult, but otherwise all the youth panel was a youth panel. And that existed for about 2 years. But I have to say, then the funding got cut and that was therefore stopped. But it is a program that we all remember and recognise that was one way in the local authority that they could actually get that voice in there by specifically creating this panel, looking at those development plans which were being done by the local authority. So it came through. And the other thing within local authority is how some have taken child-friendly policies. So they've taken it through all aspects of their planning policies and actually sometimes right across the whole council. Again, it's not an easy one because policies come and go as such. But when you actually take it from the sense of children, young people through that kind of viewpoint, then you can recognize how you can build it into your programs as well and into those departments. And another example of that is Greater Cambridge Planning Authority, where they have brought in these policies within to the youth department as well. So it's trying to do cross, we were in school, we say cross curricular, here is kind of cross departmental. But to actually do that, you really need to have buy-in from councillors. So we come back to councillors having that power. And it's really, so in effect, what I'm really saying is about leadership. So you can take these particular ones, as Azzees said, absolutely, but you still need to have that leadership to ensure that these kind of projects exist and continue to exist if you're going to engage children and young people within it.
Great, thank you, Azzees and Victoria. Some really useful tips there. One of the other things that came out of the poll, which we touched upon just a bit earlier in the webinar, is around project costs and timescale concerns, and that also being a barrier. Are you able to just expand a bit more in terms of tips that you think would be useful for our associates if they're experiencing those as part of their projects or timescales within a project or a programme?
Maybe, Azzees, shall I just go? You have much more specific. Let me take the more sort of a general one. One is that you recognise that whatever you set up is going to change over time. It's not a static time, and you have to recognise that, for example, that you start with one panel, but they will grow up, especially if you're doing like a 25-year plan of, say, housing, that you need to put in a strategy that will take account of those children, young people moving on, and how do you actually continue that voice going through, recognizing that they aren't going to be there. And I think when we do long-term plan, we start with one group, and then think, well, they've gone, now what are we going to do? So it's really about the strategy you put in place of your plan to ensure that there is this continued rollover, as it were, and actually keep them also as ambassadors. And I think that's the other thing. They become your alumni, as one calls them, or your ambassadors for that project. And that voice can continue to help into this project. So it's not just a once time, it's saying, how can I think of this over a period of time, which then we come back to budget, dare I say, recognizing you need to put this in place.
Great, thank you. Azzees, can I bring you in?
Yeah, so I think it's good to think about this in three. So in terms of project costs, we might just think about a development as having only one access to finance, but actually there's different times in which finance can be enabled. So pre-planning has a particular budget. So can we talk about pre-planning activities as engagement activities and youth community engagement activities? Post-planning, when it's more about the development and enabling the home, there's additional finance that gets released typically. So that's another opportunity for us to really build in the additional cost into that program that's already started. And then again, we have Section 106. So oftentimes there's a conversation around, how many jobs and how many apprentices that you're doing, or what is the social value that you're going to provide. But that's once a lot of conversation has already been had and opportunities to engage with young people already been had. And actually there's a conversation that different people within the sector are saying, which is sticking to arbitrary figures on the number of local people you get into work or number of apprentices is actually not that helpful for wider social impacts in that local community, because it limits the thinking around how you can add value to the community. For example, some apprentices, when recruited, they don't get to finish their particular apprenticeship on that project because maybe they're doing construction and the built and bricklaying specifically, and that only lasts a particular lifetime. And so we're seeing that teams are not being able to fulfill some of the numbers that they're putting into Section 106 and trying to say they're going to reach a certain number of apprentices. So we're trying to say, is there a more comprehensive way that we can think about this? So data has recently shown that only 13% of 16 to 18-year-olds are thinking about career in the built environment. If we drill down a little bit more, they're probably only thinking about an estate agent or construction. But there's hundreds of jobs available in the built environment sector. So when we're talking about Section 106 value, and contribution to the local community, can we talk about work experience? Can we talk about shadowing days? Can we talk about interacting with multiple different employers, which actually serves some of the school's wider aims, such as the Gatsby benchmark, where they're saying actually a lot of young people need to have multiple encounters in order to raise their aspirations. Now, I'm talking about education and trying to link that with the built environment and development. And so it requires a bit more thinking and it requires a little bit of nuance, but actually this is a really great opportunity for the built environment to provide a solution to some of the barriers that education is not being able to fulfill. And so if we're saying that at Section 106, we've got additional considerations that we want to make, then thinking about more widely the local needs and demands, this development of sort can actually be a contributor to supporting more wider aims set by the school, set by local needs of the community, or even set by the local council. But we can't just look at the development as one development and one access to finance. It has access to finance at different points. So we have to articulate in the language that best serves the finance director or the development teams to understand their levers and understand their levels of influence. And I think that's one way from a project cost perspective, we can kind of be a little bit more sophisticated about how we do that. In terms of timescales, I think this is an ongoing issue. Sometimes people think that you can engage with a group of young people really quickly, but you can to some extent, but then you might be limiting the type of young people that you want to engage with. And for the work that we do, as I mentioned earlier, we need a slightly longer timescale because it's really important for us to make sure we don't do harm when we're interacting with the community. Harm can look like so many things, but the best way to put this in my maybe more positive language is collaboration, and like true collaboration. So our team will conduct like extensive time of desk-based research in the local area, but also be meeting or having meetings with local community members in order for them to understand what our offering is. Because the worst thing for us to do is to go into an area, do a program with young people, and the local youth club never knew about it and said, why were our young people not invited? So timescale will still presents a challenge, because when we're trying to speak to developers and they might want to be pushing towards a planning submission, they may not want to consider the timescales that we actually need to do this level of collaboration meaningfully. And so we would say we need at least 2 months to 3 months to do it well, and to make sure we brought that local community in with us before we even launched the program, because getting their insights directly informs when we even suggest when we do our program. For example, we ask them, are there workshops happening a key day that local young people like to go to? So maybe it's not a Wednesday that we're having a session, maybe it's a Thursday at 6 to 8, but you can only understand that information and try to get reach more young people to actually come to your program if you ask them when they're available and when they would like to do a program like this. So it takes time. And sometimes it's just having those conversations and saying, we can't do it in the 2 weeks that you want to see a group of young people in a room. It's not going to be meaningful. And I suggest that this is an alternative. So sometimes we just have to push back on that. And sometimes it means that we're not the right fit for the organization, and that's okay as well.
Thank you, Azzees.
Come back in. And the other side of it, we talked about how can help clients. I think I've just put it on the chat room of models for measuring, the kind of ladder of children's participation. There are quite a few methodologies within this, and we sort of built one for our Engage symposium last October, but we took it from others' ladders of children's participation or youth engagement, and actually that helps you to show the value of youth engagement and where you should put it in, going back to Azzees about when it should come in, and also checking that you are doing that engagement properly. So it's when you're measuring it, you say, well, how do I measure it? Well, there are quite a few programs of these kind of ladders of learning, in a way, of engagement, which are most probably quite good to sort of pick up on for sometimes for clients, and other times for maybe for the local authorities, or even for the organizations and doing it themselves. And just picking up on Azzees about the Section 106, of course, a lot of Section 106 doesn't include youth engagement or stakeholder engagement at all, or if it does, it's not children and young people. So when one's looking at councils, it's sometimes if you're trying to find a positive route in how to put it in, it's sometimes they have a statement of community involvement, which is not a statutory policy, but it's a sort of it's their own policy if they want to put it in it. But that way you can have that statement of community involvement and explain how you want that community involvement. So it's part of the ethos of the policy of the local authorities. So sometimes it's worth just looking to see that to help you find your route in when it isn't always obvious. But I'll just send that models. These are just a few, and somebody else's as well. So I'll just put that in the chat room.
Right, thank you, Victoria and Azzees. Just conscious of time, so I just wanted to just pop in a few reflections. Lots of things in terms of challenges, tips, some really great insights. I think some of the key things that are standing out are around just that we need to ensure that when engaging with young people, we set them up with the skills for life, as well as enabling them to articulate their ideas and engage with professionals around the places that they live, as well as they might well be working and socialising in those spaces too. There's definitely a need to acknowledge that people are creative and everyone can be creative. So especially when it's not on the curriculum or in other settings around engaging with young people. Young people are definitely the voice of the future and have the ability to observe the world in a unique way, and also their communities. So it's around tapping into that as part of the process. there is definitely a need to acknowledge that there are different types of groups of young people that can be worked with in different ways, and it's around very much tailoring your approach in order to do that. We've talked a little bit about budgets. Budgets can be an enabler, and it's really important to pay young people and make sure that each programme is unique to support that young person to be involved, whether that's paying for their travel, paying for their food, thinking about really creative ways to support them to be involved. And something key that Azzees was saying was around not doing damage to young people as a key stakeholder. So therefore inviting them to get involved in ways that will be meaningful, and investing in the time to engage in communities and with children and young people as part of that. Something that Victoria was saying was around ensuring that placemaking is built into housing development, so that there's buy-in from leaders, especially around local authority leadership, and embedding child-friendly policies. That's a really interesting approach and angle to bring in. And also thinking about when youth engagement comes into that process and how you can do it properly and measure it well. That's only just several reflections as part of this session. There's a lot more, and I'm just wondering, because there is quite a lot, whether Anik and I can do a little write-up following this session, because there's lots of really useful tips and insights as part of this. We would like to ask our associates, bring our associates in, if there's anything that you'd like to share in the chat in terms of your key takeaways from today's discussion, and we'll keep an eye on any comments that you might want to put in the chats, but feel free to post those quickly and we can share those with the group.
We also have time if anyone has a question that they'd like to particularly pose to Victoria or Azzees, then we do have time for that. But also, yeah, just some key takeaways. What did you most learn from these sort of tips from our experts? I certainly know that sort of simple initiatives like having the transport ticket, for example, that, yes, you might have an afternoon activity with them, but if they have a child, a young person has a daily pass and they're able to sort of travel for the rest of the day, and then that's a kind of a benefit for them as well. But also to keep in mind that it will cost money for young people to attend even your engagement. So that sort of makes, it's got to be thinking sort of them as well. But yeah, pop some things in the chat. What did you like? And what are your questions? We've got a raised hand. So would we like to maybe go with Carl?
Yeah, thanks very much. I really enjoyed listening to you both. Thanks very much. And I do young people's engagement so I run school youth panels in master plan development, and I also, as a local councillor, developed a youth strategy for our council, and we run youth panels in schools to get the young people involved, all the young people involved, not just those who are close with the greatest social and economic capital, but all people involved, young people involved in actual council decision making. And one of the things that strikes me when you have this, when you and having run a council for a couple of years myself, there's a sense with young people, and I think it resonated what you said to me, is that there needs to be, there's a real focus on how you educate young people to take part in decision making in any domain. But I think a really important part of it is how you educate the institutions to understand why young people can add value. And a big part of and flipping that mindset is so important. So, I did a lot of work over the last couple of years in the council and saying, actually, it's not, yes, of course, it's important that we scaffold it so that young people can take part in what can be quite alien environments, but it's also really important that we do educational pieces with our local authorities so that all of our officers understand that they can really make a huge difference in your health and wellbeing area, in your planning department, in your strategy for cost of living. There's so much that they can contribute, and so the education kind of goes either side. And for me, a big part of that, whether it's working with local communities, local authorities, or with master planners, architects firms, is to really make those instrumental arguments about why not just this is a good thing to do for young people and they can add a different perspective, but actually instrumentally they can have such a huge impact in a number of different arrays for that organization. And I think if you make that leap and you can kind of get that mindset, people start to understand it in a different way rather than the sort of tokenistic thing where, oh, isn't it good to get young people involved? But anyway, that was just one thing I was thinking of as I was listening to your talk. But I really enjoyed listening to you. Thanks very much.
Azzees and Victoria, I don't know if you wanted to respond to Carl.
I would just go and say absolutely. And I think that's what I mean about leadership as such. I think without putting a butt in as an adult, I think it's where the funding, and we go back to the funding things, when you're doing cross, it's like who is championing that funding as well as the champion, but also will have that budget, because then that starts that kind of flow, the kind of outward flow as well. So I think I have to say with councils, I think councillors are really important in this thing. And to be blunt, they are the future voters, which is always what I try and remind them about. And sometimes we've got the most buy-in from going via the councillors, in my experience. So I think we shouldn't be afraid of saying, well, who's the leaders in this, and actually, help them to be able to be the champions as well. But I think what you've done is fantastic, by the way. I think it sounds brilliant. And all should be doing that.
That's perfect.
I concur. Yeah, I said it in the chat. It was really inspiring just to hear how much you've taken on a personal practice of doing this. And I think, yeah, Victoria said something about there's good work happening, but we need to and there's evidence, it's good evidence, but we need to promote it. And I think even just the way you've articulated what you do, we probably just need to promote you and talk about all the work that you've done in your capacity, because yeah, sometimes for people it does feel like it's too hard to do or it's out of their reach, but you've been able to make it happen. I'm sure not easily, but yeah, with that determination, it can be done. And so yeah, how can we talk about Carl in the work that he does in his local community? Just to show other people in the council that it can be done. I think that would be great. So sorry, Annika and Melissa, that might be an action for you guys.
I think with our TET dialogues with our community, seeing it is just specifically, TET is specifically about children and young people, engaging them. I'll be knocking your door too, I'm afraid, if you don't mind.
Yeah, we will take that challenge, I think, Nick. That'd be great. Thanks, Carl. I think we have a question from Kevin Field.
You do? Hello. I think it's just to back up some of the points that have already been made, and it's certainly around internal education. I know we've tried to use like virtual reality with young people to get them involved in kind of regeneration ideas, but the fear of trying to use virtual reality internally, it's like it's completely blown everybody's head off. And it is that we've got to find different ways to engage, and you've got to find ways internally to take value out of that. You can't just put a tinfoil helmet on. That's a little bit like virtual reality, I suppose. But yeah, and it's kind of that internal education as well. I think, I mean, we don't want to just confine young people to hoarding design, because that's exactly what it always is. And it's like, yeah, it comes back to those examples. What are the kind of examples around where it's genuinely made an impact on the development? And I think lots of opportunities have been missed, particularly not understanding the digital tools. And going back to making Airfix models rather than we can actually do this in virtual. We don't need to make a model of it. But there you go. There you go. That's my 2 pennies worth.
That's great. Thank you, Kevin. I'm just wondering if there's any more questions from our associates before we just start to wrap up. Just
seeing the kind of energy and activity within the sector around engaging with children and young people, it feels like there's a bit of a moment, but is that being converted into change that you're seeing in terms of the organizations you're working with, or that kind of institutional level, going beyond the advertising hoardings and the oh, we need to talk to young people? Is it, can you see, I guess, Victoria, you've been in this game for a while, so how do you feel in terms of progress and movement, and what can we do to build on that and make the most of it?
Yeah, I think I think I feel slightly right time, right place. I'm always an optimist. So but I think I'm going to say it's a window of opportunity at the moment. I think there's bits, but we know those windows close very quickly. I think politically, yes, and I go back to housing because we really need to say, like Homes England, for example, they need to really understand this part and parcel of their work, not just be funders. They are funders, and therefore they should be setting the pace. And I think that government level is really important, an opportunity at the moment. I think other developers are starting to build up. I mean, we've done the awards this year. This is the first time we've put in a developer award. We know it's a slow, uptake, as it were, but the point is to actually open that Pandora's box a bit. So we've done that specifically with our awards to see whether who is doing what and whether they take it seriously enough to, as it were, put in for award. That's it's quite a simple thing in a way. But I think you have different areas. You have also local plans, and I think one shouldn't forget local plans. They are still being done, and I know Swindon Council are looking, I think, and Bradford's been doing some really good work on children and young people. Sari there, so there are pockets of it. So to go back to how do we come back to evidence, and I cannot kind of re-emphasize that we need to have this evidence out there. It's all we have evidence different places, but also the problem is we need to package it in a way. And I think Azzees was articulating how we can package that, but we need to get that out and we need to get it into the media. And I have to say into the property media, where we're doing that, and to the local authority media. So we can talk, we can talk amongst ourselves, and it's great. We know we're talking to our community. We need to get it out to that other community if we're going to do that step change. And I think that's the real takeaway for me. We've got to find that way. And I think, I think there is steps being taken over this next year. It will be an important time, partly also because not only the Homes England, but also looking at the national curriculum at the moment and skills. There's just as a plug, if you don't know about it, there's a call for evidence at the moment. I can't remember which one, but it must be under, I think it's Department of Education, asking about skills and in terms of creativity. So it's the creative curriculum. So if you haven't seen that, I think I can find it, but pop it online. But I think that's the 22nd of November, nice and quick as well, I'm afraid. So it's looking at places where we can articulate it as well, and look for those. Cool.
Thank you, Victoria. We've just got a few minutes left. Azzees, if there's anything else you wanted to add in response to Matt's question.
I think really briefly, I think there is somewhat, like I'm an optimist. So I think that the fact that we're even having this conversation, and there's been many conversations I've been to just this month, I think it's like 11. That's good, right? So like we're having the right conversation, but I sometimes do wonder, do we have the right people in the rooms when we're having these conversations? And oftentimes many of us in the room agree. So how can we penetrate groups that don't maybe agree or aren't doing this work in a way that reaches them in a meaningful way? I think we do need to challenge ourselves on that a little bit more. I see many companies and local authorities doing great work, and there's a few that stand out to me, and they're doing it across the board, not just because they work with us, but because they're doing it well across the board. But that's few and far between in the grand scheme of the number of developers coming forward and influencing our local communities. And I think a key element that should be a driver of this should be the MPPF. We know that there is a point here around community engagement, but what do we actually mean? And can the government speak to, given a clear example of what they mean when they're talking about community? Can we name certain groups that are often overlooked, so that it's a clear signpost to say, oh, this is what we're expecting you to do, or this is how we're expecting you to. And it's not, I don't think the MPP should be there to be prescriptive or to be a barrier. I think it should be an enabler of that creative thinking of who is the community that we're reaching out to. So that's my final thought on that.
Thank you. It doesn't look like there's any other questions. So just very quickly in the last couple of minutes, we have a final question for our panelists, which is what's the one thing on your wish list for children and young person engagement for 2025?
Azzees, I'll let you go first, I think.
Oh no. Do you know what? I've been thinking about this. I have been thinking about this, and I think my simple answer is greater collaboration. So with organizations like ours and with comms agencies and with researchers and with schools, all of us collaborating and recognizing that actually if we do good youth engagement, we can address many different issues that communities want to address, but we can only do that if we actually collaborate. And I went to a really great conversation, canteen conversation last week that had a genuine mixture of people from across the board, whether they're educators, universities, secondary school, architects, planners, sustainable managers, developers, local authority. And that to me was a really great conversation around and a representation, sorry, of collaboration. And I think us doing that more will really, really help young people more generally because we're having one clear vision of how we can support them.
Thank you. Victoria?
Well, actually, I was thinking about, think about exactly, there's so much, and this is the trouble, even the built environment, we talk about it. So we've been sort of thinking about themes. So we've used sustainability, you can do health and well-being, but if you sort of, I'm going to be quite hard on it. If we do look economic, so kind of what we want on the economy, then sustainability, climate change brings up skills and it within the built environment. So actually, I think sometimes finding a hook as opposed to trying to do everything, and partly because we end up with all different departments and everything else. But at least if we start with a hook and then we can build out of that, and that actually will start with also bring us into education in schools under STEM and everything. So there are ways to connect these dots together. So maybe it's for me is saying, okay, maybe we need to focus on a theme for youth engagement as one of the aspects that can bring together these different major many agencies as well, but also that political. Because I think at the end of the day, and I think I said to someone at Architects, what we're talking about is political. Whether it's youth engagement or built environment, both are political. And it's not a nice to have, it's a must have in my mind. So that's how we always state it.
Thank you. That's great, Victoria. Thank you very much to Azzees and Victoria and our associates. We've just run out of time, but I'll hand back everything over to Anik to close the session. But yeah, thank you for joining today.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. Just to reiterate, thank you so much for your time, Victoria and Azzees. It's been wonderful to have a really robust discussion. We have one little announcement regarding our code of practice, which we're actually on collaboration. We're looking to reach children and young people to collaborate on co-designing a resource to sit alongside our code of practice for community engagement. So we're looking for rural, suburban, coastal, and city contexts to be able to speak with organizations who work with young people and might be interested in collaborating with us. So we'd love to know if any of our associates network have contact with organizations who work with children and young people, particularly sort of across the UK and in coastal areas. So we're seeking all suggestions. So please do send those emails through to mail@quof.org, and I'll include that in an email. But again, thank you so much for joining us today and for the sessions this year. And I hope you have a nice break and festive season. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.